What stuck out to you about this video? For me, it helped me remember that all norms, rules, and dominant cultures are not fixed. We, as individuals, can voice our concerns regarding what should be taught in schools and advocate curricula changes, whatever they may be. For instance, in early 2017, parents and policymakers initiated petitions to urge the Vancouver School Board to implement sexual orientation and gender identity curricula, called SOGI 123, into classrooms to teach students about gender identities and sexual inclusivity. By November of 2017, according to the BC Government News, there were 49 school districts in BC that became part of the BC SOGI Education Network interested in SOGI inclusive education. Currently, the BC SOGI Education Network has grown to 60 out of 60 school districts. Functionalist scholars in sociology argue that education as an institution serves two kinds of functions in society. The first kind is the intended and visible function. We call this manifest function. Usually, it's transmitted via formal curriculum and lesson plans in formal education. The second kind is the hidden and unintended function. We call this latent function. Hidden curriculum is an example of the latent function of education. So, what's the manifest function of education? The most obvious one is to teach students formal curriculum and lessons. Formal curriculum and lesson plans reflect on a public consensus on, quote, what should and shouldn't be taught in schools. Meanwhile, school systems are crucial socializing agents that teach children norms, rules, and dominant culture of the society, as well as the core values of the nation. Schools also have a social control function in teaching children that they need to conform to law and respect authority. When this is done explicitly, it is part of the manifest functions of education. And lastly, as the old saying goes, knowledge is power. Education is commonly regarded as the method for students to move up the social mobility ladder by choosing majors that will lead to economically advantaged careers. In particular, accessing high-quality post-secondary education is believed to be a crucial indicator for later economic success. Education also fulfills many latent functions, for example, introducing students to social networks that might help them to connect to future job opportunities. However, extensive research has shown that the access to elite education is not equal between high socioeconomic status groups and low socioeconomic status groups. For example, this research by Jarim et al. From 2015 has shown that despite variation in higher education designs in the United Kingdom, United States, and Australia, higher socioeconomic status groups dominate elite schools in a similar magnitude. When resources are unequally distributed between private schools, public schools, and tertiary schools, the access to the social networks tied to these schools can reinforce income and social inequality. One might argue that the latent function or unintended function of our current higher education system is to maintain the social stratification and perpetuate inequalities between groups of different socioeconomic status, because education allows members of privileged social groups to accumulate greater educational and economic advantages, while those of less privileged backgrounds continue to be economically and educationally disadvantaged. The degree of disadvantage differs from country to country, depending on how the school system is organized and funded. Thinking about this existing socioeconomic inequality and its implications for education, how do COVID-19 school closures and remote education set up students and families from different socioeconomic statuses to respond? In this Business Insider article, we learn about two Princeton grads who have bought out hotels in Hawaii and Arkansas with the expectation that wealthier students will pay them to study in this hotel bubble, a new remote college experience, certainly not accessible to everyone. We can think more broadly about COVID-19 school closures and socioeconomic status. We also see the rise of private tutoring for wealthier families in the context of COVID. This NBC News piece is called "Many Parents Want It, Few Can Afford It. Amid School Uncertainty, Private Tutoring Ramps Up." Families who can afford it are also creating education pods and micro schools, attempting to address the crisis within their own bubble. This New York Times article subheading reads, "As school openings remain in flux, families grapple with big questions about safety, money, and politics." I recorded this lecture in August 2020, before we knew what would happen with schooling in the fall. At this time, newspaper headings from the Washington Post read, "For parents who can afford it, a solution for fall. Bring the teachers to them." And Market Watch reported, "From nanny services to private educators, wealthy parents are paying up to $100 an hour for teaching pods during the pandemic." What are some other implications of COVID-19 school closures for economic inequality? Let's go back to the latent functions of education. School is also one of the most common places to meet future romantic partners. Research has shown that people tend to marry or at least partner with people they are similar to, including who have similar education. This is an important indicator of social closeness because families can reproduce their advantage or disadvantage status. In other words, when people tend to marry someone with similar education, the chances of social mobility between different socioeconomic status groups are likely to decrease. Another latent function of education is to teach people skills that are important in professional settings. For example, teamwork capabilities, which benefit students in the professional world, or critical thinking, which is an important factor that research has shown shapes one's career and mate selection. Another latent function of schooling is sorting, namely classifying students based on academic performance and potential. Based on their academic performance and compulsory education, students are sorted into different kinds of post-secondary institutions. For example, students who performed well in academics are expected to attend university, while students with lower grades according to the standard tests are guided into vocational training. Put together, social networks, skills, and the types of post-secondary schools you go to, and credentials are examples of cultural capital. French sociologist, anthropologist, and philosopher Pierre Bourdieu conceptualized this idea of cultural capital as a major source of social inequality. We can understand cultural capital as cultural knowledge that serves metaphorically as currency to help one navigate a culture. It refers to a wide variety of symbolic things ranging from skills, tastes, manners, clothing, artwork, lifestyles, language, styles of speaking, credentials, and so on. The phrase cultural fit that we commonly hear in hiring processes or other group settings is an illustration of how people tend to be attracted to someone who has similar cultural capital to themselves. The cultural capital a person is able to display, intentionally or unintentionally, is one way we can tell that person's social position within the social order. Consider some random conversation points that might be dropped during a job interview about past travels around the world, going to the same post-secondary institution as your employer, having a taste for the same expensive food and wine, being able to remark on the artwork hanging in the office wall, and generally having access to information, spaces, and experiences that are difficult to access due to finances, time, and necessary and limited knowledge. The language of cultural fit used in many hiring processes is ultimately a mechanism to sort based on cultural capital and maintain social order within systems of social stratification. Research has shown that rather than solely sorting on skills and absolute productivity, hiring committees in elite professional service firms sought candidates who were culturally similar to the evaluators and firms, namely a process of cultural matching in terms of leisure pursuits, experiences, presentation styles, and especially lifestyles. Taking the findings further and recalling our previous lectures on race and racism, we can see that such cultural matching in a society with particular racial or ethnic majorities puts racial or ethnic minorities in a further disadvantaged position in hiring processes. Bourdieu breaks cultural capital down into several forms. For example, embodied, objectified, and institutionalized. Embodied capital is embedded within the person. So this might be a way of seeing the world or your way of speaking that conveys a particular status. Objectified capital is related to a person's property. So having an expensive yacht or a limited edition art piece would be objectified cultural capital. What we are interested in today is institutionalized cultural capital. An academic credential is an example of institutionalized cultural capital, which signifies cultural competence and authority in a specialized area. This is cultural capital that is institutionally legitimized and recognized. Hanging your degree from an elite institution on the wall is one way of demonstrating institutional cultural capital. Another way is to list your education credentials at the top of your resume or name drop them in a conversation. We can see how cultural capital can transmit into economic capital through credentialism. Credentialism is the emphasis on certificates or degrees to show that a person has a certain skill, has attained a certain level of education, or has met certain job qualifications. Some argue that the university degree has become, quote, the ultimate status symbol for entry into the middle classes around the world, unquote. While credentials require substantial cultural and economic capital to achieve, credentials are gatekeepers for graduates' career success and thus economic prosperity, a cycle of reproduction of inequality. If some groups systematically have less access or likelihood of obtaining these credentials. Another latent function of colonialist education systems that we cannot forget about is the exclusion and assimilation of racial minorities and Indigenous peoples. The Canadian residential school system had two crucial functions. First, to exclude Indigenous communities by removing and isolating their children from their families, traditions, and cultures. Over 150,000 children were forcibly sent to one of 130 residential schools. Second, to assimilate these children into Canadian society by forcing them to speak English and indoctrinating them into Christianity and Euro-Canadian norms, values, ways of living, and institutions. For more information about residential schooling and its lasting impact on Indigenous communities in Canada, I have put a link to the full Truth and Reconciliation executive summary with the 94 calls to action under the bonus reading section in this module. Keeping in mind that residential schools only closed in Canada in the late 1990s, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission only started in 2008, many scholars argue that education continues to perpetuate social inequalities against Indigenous communities. According to a 2013 report, the average funding gap between First Nations schools and other schools across Canada is around 30%. There is also an inequitable distribution of funding between schools on reserve or Indigenous communities and schools not on reserve. According to Evan Te-Potat, chief of the Kakawistaha First Nation, the average funding for a child on his reservation is about $6,800, yet the funding for a child in Broadview in Ottawa, which is about 10 or so minutes away, is $11,000. According to the 2017 report, Education as a Social Determinant of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Health, the limited funding and access to schools and educational programs in remote areas is one of the primary barriers to learning for Indigenous peoples. Additionally, needing to live off reserve or be away from their families just to attend secondary school makes accessing and maintaining supportive social networks a significant barrier to high school completion for First Nation students living on reserve. Education is one of the most important determinants of socioeconomic status. And this applies not only for the economic status of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, but also a social determinant of their well-being. However, Indigenous communities and their knowledge are continually marginalized and devalued in the Canadian colonial education system and society as a whole. Indigenous activists and scholars advocate for the decolonization of education systems in Canada and the incorporation of Indigenous principles and ways of learning into Indigenous education. Take a moment to look at these 3 ways to decolonize education suggested by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. After reading these recommendations, what would you suggest to decolonize the education system in Canada or elsewhere? And how might these recommendations be informed by remote education and limited education under COVID? In light of all of this background context about the sociology of education, the main focus of today's mini lectures, which I will now introduce, are education, summer setback, and COVID-19. With our guest lecturer, Nicole Malette, we will first identify general influences for academic inequalities across students and unpack the concept and theory of summer setback, as well as its impact on students. Then, we will explore how COVID-19 influences global academic setback. And lastly, we will consider solutions for both summer setback and global academic setback under this pandemic. Nicole Malette is a PhD candidate in sociology at UBC and an instructor for the sociology department. Nicole teaches Introduction to Sociology and Canadian Society classes. Nicole's dissertation research consists of a multi-level analysis of how post-secondary institutional contexts impact individual students' mental health. Her general research interests include the sociology of education, social inequality, student mental health, and higher education.